Hey everybody, it's John from JB's Little Gaming, and I was really excited when I heard about Scythe, and I'm really excited to do a review for it now. Now I know a lot of other people are really excited about this game too. For me personally, I really enjoy a lot of Jamie Stegmaier games. Euphoria is actually my favorite theme in any board game of all time. It's not my favorite board game, but I really like the theme. It reminds me of Anthem by Ayn Rand, the Ayn Rand story that's short enough to actually enjoy. And I really, really like Viticulture, and it's one of the favorite games in our gaming group and gets played fairly often. And this game, for those of you who aren't familiar about it, so how you got to find my channel when you're not familiar with Scythe, I don't know how that happened, but it is, if I were to describe it to a board gamer, it is a hybrid game. It is a combination of a somewhat economic Euro where you're managing resources along with somewhat of a war game. And if you're not familiar with exactly what that means, I'll show you real quick on the board. So in a traditional Euro or European style game where you're managing resources, you might use your workers in order to gather resources, and you would often convert those resources into other things. Like, for example, I might be able to turn this wood into a building, and then that building might help me to get even more resources, and then I can use those resources to convert into other things and get the whole economic cycle going. And this game certainly has that. But like I said, this is a hybrid game, so you might be gathering some resources like this food. And in fact, you might even be stockpiling some food, and all that's fine and dandy, but, well, until your enemy decides that you're a big enough threat and they want to come in and kick you out and take all those resources. So that's what makes this game a little bit different than a lot of other games. Like some other hybrid games like Eclipse, you were balancing both your economy and also combat out on the board. The turn structure in Scythe is actually pretty simple at first glance. You'll take your marker that says what you want to do and you'll place it on one of your 4 actions. You'll pay a red cost in order to get a green benefit. Whenever you choose one of these spaces, you can do either one of the 2 actions or both of the 2 actions, and the only rule is you have to do the top one first if you're going to do both. So in this example, we don't actually have to pay anything, but as we get more workers out onto the board, we'll see certain symbols in the red area representing our increasing workforce. See, this is what I was talking about, representing kind of an economy in the game. The more workers that we have out, the more that we can produce, and then the more it's going to cost to have those workers to produce. So we pay the cost and get the benefit, which is producing on 2 tiles. And then if we can pay for the bottom action, we can do that as well. And, well, these again are going to have a cost and a benefit, and we'll go over what each of them are in a little bit, not in detail, but in particular the bottom actions. But in this case, we're talking about spending 4 wood in order to get a building and 2 gold. So it's simple enough. Now that I told you how simple Scythe is, let's talk about how it's not simple and get to the first maybe potential negative of the game. Now when I say potential, I say that because this isn't going to be a negative for everyone, but maybe for some people. Because while the game is pretty simple as far as put your piece down and do 1 or 2 actions, and it tells you what to do, there are a lot of complexities within what happens with those actions. For example, these are your mechs, and each faction has individual mechs that all look different, not just colored different, which is neat. But whenever you deploy one of these mechs, which is a military force in the game, because you don't want workers out there, this is also a combat game, you get to choose which one you want to deploy, and then you unlock a special power. Now, every one of the factions is going to have slightly different special powers. They're all going to have this Riverwalk ability where their character, which in this case would be this person here, who can also participate in combat, and each different faction has a different main character. And the mechs can cross rivers, but only to certain spaces. And each faction has different spaces they can cross to. And then there's a movement ability, which is different for each faction. The combat ability that is different for each faction. And then each faction, this one is actually the same, where those units get 1 extra movement when they move. And the complexity of keeping all that in mind, who can move to what spaces, who river walks to where, who has what abilities unlocked, exactly what those abilities do, can be a lot to take in, especially for your first game. And there are a lot of other little things, like each faction has a special ability that only applies to them. And there's a lot of these other just little rules. So while Scythe is a pretty simple game in concept, there are a lot of little things, and that could drag down for some players who aren't interested in that level of complexity of little detailed rules. Now, one thing that's simple enough is the game ends whenever any player gets all 6 of their stars out. Well, it is a Jamie Stegmaier game, so we're going to have stars. So the way you get stars out, there's actually a bunch of different ways, and definitely more than 6 ways to do it. So these top actions are all relatively simple. You pay something to get something. A movement, maybe some resources, maybe producing on some tiles, or some power that you can use in combat, and a few other little potential things. But these bottom actions are going to be one of the ways that you can get stars. For example, this one here that says upgrade allows you to take a cube from on top of your board and then move it down to one of the spaces on the bottom of your board that has these spaces available, and you can see that the cubes fit in there. So I wouldn't be able to cover these two up, but I would be able to cover these two up. You don't have to move it from one action to the same action. You can move it anywhere you want. So now whenever I take the move action, and let me move this guy here, I can move 2 different units one space, or normally I could gain 1 coin instead, but now I can gain 2 coins if that's what I want to do instead. And now when I take the deploy action, instead of costing me 4 metal, it'll cost me 3 because I've covered one of them up. Another little minor complexity is while you're going to be playing a certain faction, you're also going to have different player boards that maybe say that you're agricultural or mechanical or something else, and they're going to have different costs and benefits for each one of these bottom 4 actions. The actions are the same, but the costs and benefits will differ. So upgrading is really nice. Deploying is how you get your mechs out, and then obviously you can have up to 4 mechs out onto the board because that's what you start with. And then we have build, where you build different structures. And each one of the actions here has a structure on it, and basically it gives you a special ability. Mills allow you to produce more, armories give you power in combat. Whenever you take this action, you see how it's up here, and you get it along with the green stuff, so whenever you take the trade action, you'll get that. So, and we're not going to get into every detail of the game, but just so you know, that's the build action. And then over here we have enlist. So enlist allows you to take one of these off, and it doesn't have to be the one on enlist, it can be any of them. And then whenever you, or the player to your left or right, takes this bottom action, so in this case build, you'll get a bonus. And here, this is the symbol for popularity. So that'll trigger, and then you will get that benefit whenever that happens. Now the reason why I'm talking about all these specifically though, is the ways that you get stars include doing all of your upgrades, or building all of your mechs, or getting all of your buildings built, or getting all of those enlistment actions done. Those are some of the ways you can get them out. Another way is to get people out onto the board to have all your workers out. Now you may remember at the beginning of the video I was talking about using your workers to get resources. And for example, if you take the produce action, here you would get 1 wood. If you have 2 workers here, you get 2 wood on that space if that's a tile you choose to activate. And you can get metal that way, and food that way, and also oil on tundras. So all of that is pretty neat. The way you get more workers is by activating on a village space. So if I move this up a little bit here, we can see this has a meeple symbol, and I'll get more workers. They're not considered a resource, but that's how you get them. So you want your workers out on the board to gather resources, but then it makes it a threat, because remember how I said, opponents can come in and take over those spaces. And if they attack a space with a worker, then that worker will have to go back to their home base. Nothing ever really dies in this game, it always just goes back to your home base, even military units. This isn't considered on the board, so you have to move it back on. But it is kind of a big deal. However, if you're, a tyrant who comes in and takes over land and kicks workers out, you're going to lose popularity. So let's talk a little bit about how combat works if you are in a space. And the easy way to remember combat is these wood pieces, workers don't participate in combat, and buildings don't have any effect on combat, but any plastic pieces, like your character or your mech, can get involved in combat. So this is the combat track, and during the game, power is a resource that you can gain through several different means, but mainly the action where you're going to gain power on your player board, which is the bolster action, and is one of the top actions. And you can gain all the way up to 16 power, which will earn you a star if you get that. And if you go below 16, you don't lose that star. But whenever you enter into combat, you choose how much power you want to spend on this dial. Now the dial only goes up to 7, and you see a reminder here that 7 is the most power you can spend. Now the thing about military units is they don't have any effect on the battle. So even if you have, say, your character and 1 mech in the battle, they don't have any combat value whatsoever. What they do allow you to do, however, is use combat cards. So combat cards are another resource you can get through the bolster action instead of getting power, and there's other ways you can get them, and they range from 2 to 5. So what you can do, if, say, for example, you have 2 units in a combat, is tuck 2 of your combat cards in here if you want, and then players will simultaneously reveal how much power they've used. Now this doesn't take away from their power, but you do lose the cards, and the loser gets a card in compensation if they've spent at least 1 total power. Whoever wins, having the most power, wins the combat, and the loser has to send everyone back to their home base. So now that we've talked about power, let's talk about popularity. I've already mentioned you can lose popularity by kicking workers out when you're the attacker, but there's also means that you can gain it on your player board, and also by doing certain actions in events, basically, that'll happen. We'll get to that in a second. Now, you do get a star by getting all the way up to 18 on popularity, which is cool. But it also affects the end of the game scoring. So you'll score a certain number of points for the stars you have out, for the territories you control, and for every 2 resources that you control at the end of the game. And the higher section you're in, the more points you're going to score for that. So it is a very important factor. So these encounters that your character can have, at the start of the game, every one of these spaces will have a token on it, and they can come across these encounters, but only your kind of main character, that one individual piece, can have these encounters. And in a brilliant design decision, there isn't flavor text as to what's going on in these situations. There's just a picture that you're encouraged to show everyone. And then you have basically moral choices that allow your character to decide the cost and benefit for taking certain actions. And each one of these is gorgeous and some of the best art that I have seen in a game maybe ever. Now, we're not going to get into everything about the game. There's a whole nother thing about the factory, the center section. It's worth 3 sectors at the end of the game as far as what you control, and it gives you a whole nother option as to things to do, so you have 5 actions to choose from. But we're not going to get into every little rule. I do want to talk, though, about the last ways that you can gain stars. You notice there are 2 spaces for winning combats. So whenever you win a combat, you can put a star out up to 2 times, but no more. There is one faction that can break that rule. So the thing about combat in this game is, even though there is possibly a decent amount of combat, depending on the players that you're playing with and their play styles, you can't have just a ton of combat because combats cost resources and your units don't actually have any power in and of themselves. You constantly have to spend cards and or power in order to win combats. So there may be less combat than you'd expect. So if you really enjoy games like Blood Rage or something like that, you may feel like this game could drag a little bit and not have enough of that. So that's another possible negative. There may be less combats than you expect. Now you can certainly go out there and initiate combat. You can only do it so often though. This is really a hybrid game, and it does focus fairly heavily on that resource management and also possibly using your combat forces to deter combat as much as encourage it on occasions. Now, the very last way that you can potentially get a star out is by completing your objective. You'll be given 2 objective cards at the end of the game, and then another nice design decision about this game is you don't have to discard one. You don't have to pick one at the start of the game. You can see how the game is going and change your plans. And that is a real positive thing I do like about the game. There is the ability to adapt. Not only do you have those 2 possible options to get that card out, depending on how things are going, but you may have a plan that you really can change in this game. Unlike some other games that you have to play long term, you can change up what you're doing, but you do want to specialize. You can't do all these things, and if you try to do that, you won't get enough stars out by the end of the game. You have to figure out the things you definitely want to get out, and then other things you want to work on, and not try to do everything at once. So I've mentioned some potential negatives of the game if you're not really into a lot of those little rules, or maybe if you're expecting more combat. But again, potential negatives. And some positives: the artwork, the variability of the way to play. There's a solo game in this that I actually enjoy, and I don't often play solo games. The game also plays surprisingly well at 2. I've played it at 2 and also at 5, and actually liked it better at 2, just because it can grind a little bit, especially with new players. But usually, as long as players aren't APing too much, turns aren't too complicated, and players can start their next turn while you're figuring out what to do with your lower action, deciding maybe where to upgrade or something like that. And real quickly, I want to throw in how awesome that popularity track is. The whole idea of trying to be as popular as you can to score more at the end of the game, but at the same time, maybe knowing that the end of the game is looming and you have to get those stars out, is maybe my favorite mechanism in the game. So overall, this is a game I really enjoy. Can I universally recommend it? No, it isn't going to be for everyone. I do think this is a really good game, though. A hybrid game that stands up there with other hybrid games that I personally really enjoy, like Eclipse. So if that's the sort of gameplay you like, where you're balancing that European gameplay idea of managing your resources and building an economy with also that threat of war, but not a huge focus on the war, then I can highly recommend this game. Whereas then if both the having a lot of rules and also having combat, but not totally focusing on combat, doesn't really suit you, then I can't really say this game suits you. Does it replace Viticulture as my favorite game by this designer? I'll need a little bit more time to decide that, but overall I have really enjoyed it, and if those negatives aren't something that bothers you and you like what you've heard, then it's a game that I can definitely recommend for those people. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.